All right, engineers, in this video today, we are going to talk about the gray matter of the spinal cord. So let's go and get started. All right, engineers, so when we talk about the gray matter of the spinal cord, we obviously have to have an understanding of what in the heck gray matter is. So let's take here, we have a neuron. Here on the neuron, we obviously have these little extensions coming off of the neuron. What are these things called? These are called our dendrites, right? Little kind of extensions coming off, the receptors on them that respond to neurotransmitters. Then here we have the cell body, sometimes referred to as the soma, right? Then coming off of that cell body, going down here to your axon terminals, we have our axon. And then again, lastly, we have this last portion here called our axon terminal, or our terminal bulb, whichever one you prefer. What I want us to know is that there's these little fatty lipid sheaths that are surrounding, insulating, covering this axon. What are these lipid sheaths here called? These are your myelin sheaths. And your myelin sheaths are a lipid kind of protein structure that allows for action potentials to be carried very quickly along that axon. We're not going to go into detail of it now, but you guys remember what these little nodes are called between these myelin sheaths. They're called the nodes of Ranvier, right? And action potentials skip along these, which allows for quick conduction, which is called saltatory conduction. We know that. We'll talk about that later. But what I want you to understand is wherever you see myelin, I want you to remember that's going to be what is causing the neuron to appear whitish, okay? So wherever there is myelin, it is white. Wherever there is not myelin, that is gray matter. So here, let's take a look here at this structure here. You see how we have the cell body and the dendrites? That's going to be pretty much making up a lot of our gray matter. Another thing to add on though, is if there is axons, let's say that we had another neuron. Here's another neuron. And this neuron here had no myelin sheaths covering that axon. If there is no myelin covering that axon, guess what that axon is? It doesn't have the myelin, it's not going to appear white, so therefore it is gray matter. So remember, a lot of the time we say gray matter is unmyelinated cell bodies and dendrites. For the most part it is, but there's a couple areas in the body where the axons are not myelinated, and therefore that is also gray matter, okay? So we know what gray matter is. It's basically the structures of the neuron that are not myelinated. Next thing we have to talk about, which I'll use a lot throughout the course of this video, is what in the heck is the term for a nucleus and what in the heck is the term for a ganglia. So let's imagine here we have a group of cell bodies. I'm just going to have a bunch of cell bodies here, okay? And this is the cell bodies of our neuron. Here's a bunch of cell bodies of a neuron, okay? I have a bunch of neurons. These clumps, this whole clump or group of cell bodies in the actual central nervous system. So this kind of group of cell bodies in the central nervous system is referred to as a nucleus. The group of cell bodies which are clustered together in the peripheral nervous system are referred to as a ganglia. Okay, so we know what gray matter is. It's the part of the neuron that's not myelinated. We know a nucleus is a group of cell bodies in the CNS. Group of cell bodies in the PNS is a ganglia. Now, next thing we have to talk about is the anatomical portions of the gray matter. There's special names, right? We already know a lot of these. This is going to be a quick reminder. We have here, this portion here. What is this portion here? This gray matter here. These kind of like shaded in portions here. What is this? This is called our posterior gray horn. We already know this. And then if we have this other region here, let's kind of shade this one here. We have this one, which I'm going to box here. This is called our anterior gray horn. This is called our anterior gray horn. Now there's a last one that I want to talk about briefly here. And we're going to kind of call this one here and this one here. You see how this is kind of what we're going to call the intermediate zone. We're going to call this for right now the intermediate zone. But what I want you to remember is that in this intermediate zone, we have lateral gray horns, which come off of a specific part in the spinal cord. So if we have this intermediate zone, okay, at what level do these horns kind of pop off that intermediate zone? You have lateral gray horns. So we're going to write this on this side. It's a part of the intermediate zone. Lateral gray horns. They're the parts that are coming off of this intermediate zone only at T1 to L2. And we'll talk about their functions a little bit later. Last thing that I want you guys to know is, let's say that here I kind of make a line coming here and a line here. So this horn, this anterior intermediate zone and anterior gray horn, this posterior horn, intermediate zone, and anterior gray horn are connected through a sliver of tissue here. And that sliver of tissue connecting the two sides of the horn is called our gray commissure. Beautiful. So we know the posterior horn, right? We know our intermediate zone at the T1L2 region. Coming off of it is the lateral gray horn and anterior gray horn. And we know the central or gray commissure here connecting the two sides of that horn. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about is the basic function of these horns. So we're going to have one side, right? And what I want us to do here is we're going to kind of circle this portion here. The posterior gray horn, we know it's responsible for what type of function. Remember, the posterior gray horn is, I just wanted you to remember on that last video we talked about, the gross anatomy of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. It's primarily sensory function. Okay, now we're going to talk about this kind of this intermediate zone and this anterior gray horn. This is going to be primarily for motor functions. Let's break it down even a little bit more. Okay, when we look at the posterior gray horn, right, what I want you to remember is that it's picking up sensations. It's sensory neurons which are located in this area. But it's going to be sensory neurons here in green. I want you to remember that they're picking up somatic sensations. What does that mean? Somatic sensations means it's picking up sensations from the skin, from your skeletal muscles, all right, from your joints, from your tendons, from your ligaments, and things like that. Whereas other parts of your posterior horn are going to pick up what's called visceral sensations. What are visceral sensations? It's sensations which are coming from your internal organs, your heart, your lungs, your GI tract, things of that nature. Then we have that motor function, right? Well, the motor function you're going to have here in that intermediate zone, that's going to be able to be responsible for visceral motor functions. So in other words, this is going to be going to your smooth muscle, to your cardiac muscle, to the glands, right? A part of your sympathetic, parasympathetic motor nervous system. Then here anterior, most ventral, this is going to be motor neurons for the somatic nervous system. So this is somatic motor going to your skeletal muscles. Okay? So that is what I want you to know when we talk about basic anatomy and basic function. Now, let's dig in a little bit deeper into this gray matter. All right, so we know the basic concept of the gray matter of the spinal cord, but we're ninja nerds. We got to dive in. We got to dive in deep. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about another concept here called Rex lamina or lamina of Rex and their associated nuclei within the gray matter. So Rex lamina basically was a way that we can categorize or separate the different areas of the gray matter on our spinal cord here. And it's a really simple system, thank goodness, that if we just numbered this, as we go from posterior to anterior, you're going to be going here, the first lamina, lamina 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now from 1 to 6, this is pretty much the Rex lamina that make up most of your posterior gray horn, right? Then you get into that intermediate zone we talked about. That's primarily occupied by lamina 7. Then we get into the anterior gray horn, and the anterior gray horn is primarily occupied by lamina 9. We're going to have the lamina 9 here, and lamina 8. And there's one more. So we kind of worked away all the way 1 to 6 for posterior horn, the 7 primarily for intermediate horn, 8 and 9 for anterior horn. Well, guess what that little structure was that we had connecting the two horns? That was called our gray commissure. That's called our central lamina, right? That's the central zone. That's going to be lamina 10. Okay, so that's one way that we could define this. So this way that we can categorize the different parts of the gray matter of the spinal cord is called the Rex lamina. The other way that we can categorize it is that there are specific nuclei that are present in specific lamina and have specific functions. What are those nuclear structures? So you see here we have this one shaped like a P. There's a reason why. It is called our posterior marginal nucleus. What is it called? The posterior marginal nucleus. Sweet. That's that one. The next one here, this one's shaped like an S. Oh, real quick though. Posterior marginal nucleus. We said that these occupy certain lamina, right? Which lamina does the posterior marginal nucleus occupy? Primarily lamina 1. Then you have the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando. That's the S. That's what that one's for. So this is called the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando. One heck of a name, right? That's going to be primarily occupying lamina 2. Then we have this next one here in green. This is called the nucleus proprius. This is called the nucleus proprius. And the nucleus proprius primarily occupies laminas 3 and 4. Beautiful. Okay, that pretty much takes care of what we said, lamina 1, 2, 3, 4. Now 5 and 6, they do have little nuclei in them, but I don't really want to focus on those. We'll talk about their function separately, okay? Now the next one is we get into this intermediate zone. That was around lamina 7. There's 3 specific nuclei situated here. Let's go from medial all the way out to lateral. So let's get this pink marker in here. C. What does C stand for? That's Clark's column, or Clark's nucleus. So this is Clark's column, or Clark's nucleus. That is what this one is here, right? So we have Clark's column, or Clark's nucleus, which is most medial. That's occupied within lamina 7. Again, these 3 are going to be in lamina 7. Then we have this M. This one's a weird one, but they love to do this stuff. This is called your medial nucleus group, right? So the medial nucleus. There's an M there. That's the reason why we had that one there, right? So we got our medial nucleus. And again, this is going to be occupied within lamina 7. Last one here. That's occupying lamina 7. This is that brownish color here. That's this one, L. That's anteromedial lateral nucleus. This is our medial lateral nucleus. These are sons of a guns, aren't they? And this is going to be occupying lamina 7. Beautiful. Okay, now we're going to talk about lamina 8, okay, a little bit later. Lamina 8, there is no specific type of nuclei associated there, but we'll talk about what the functions of those nuclei are for a little bit later in the video. Lamina 10, no specific nucleus associated here. This is really just the simplest thing to know about lamina 10, is that this is where the axons cross over from one side to the other. That's really all it is. And it's called the gray commissure. And if the axons are crossing and it's gray, what does that mean about those axons? They're not myelinated. That goes to show you what the gray matter is. Okay, let's come here to this last part, lamina 9. Lamina 9, we're actually going to zoom in a little bit more in here for, but this is going to be a part of our nuclear group, right? And it's really simple. This is our lateral nuclear group, this is our central nuclear group, and this is our medial nuclear group. But what I want us first to do is take this nuclear groups here, with the ventral gray horn, and zoom in on it, talk about some of the anatomy, the somatotopic arrangement, and function. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a little bit more about the structures within laminas 9, and we'll talk again, we'll briefly recap 10. So we're taking this cross-section of spinal cord here, right? And what we're doing is we're going to zoom in on these nuclear groups. Remember these? We had already talked about those up there. Our medial, central, and lateral nuclear groups. We're going to cut this off and then zoom in on it, right? So this is going to be right here on this part of that black line. This is that medial side, and this is that lateral side. Okay, so this is over here, this is over here. Simple, kind of like a basic outline of the anatomy. Now, nuclear groups. We already gave these guys names. Lateral nuclear group. This is our central nuclear group. And this is our medial nuclear group. We already know that. What I also want you to know is something really interesting. The lateral nuclear group, you know, it's actually only present, let's see if you guys remember this, at C5 to T1 and at L2 to S3. Do you guys remember where that was in the spinal cord, in that gross anatomy video? If we only find these at 2 sections, we only find these at C5 to T1, and we only find this at L2 to S3. What were those areas in the spinal cord segments? That was our cervical enlargement and our lumbar enlargement. Why is that significant? Do you guys remember what we said happens in those areas? In those areas, if I draw a cross section here, or I draw a sagittal section here, right? Remember I said that there was a little bulbous portion here and a little bulbous portion here. Remember we said that these were bulbous in these areas because that's where there was more gray matter in that anterior gray horn, particularly in the lateral region, and that these were going to the muscles of the upper limbs, so the cervical enlargement, so upper extremity, and lower extremity for the lumbar enlargement. That's why that's important. Okay? Beautiful. Next thing, we have our central nuclear group. Now, the central nuclear group here actually has a couple nuclei kind of spersed within it. So there's a couple nuclei that are spersed within this that I want to talk about. And you can kind of see them here. We're going to kind of zoom in on them over here. The reason why is they have specific areas that they serve. So in that central nuclear group, there's three particular nuclei that I want you to remember. One is a P for the phrenic nucleus, A for accessory spinal nucleus, and O for onus nucleus. Okay, why do I want you to know this? You guys know the phrenic nerve, which supplies the diaphragm. From what areas of the spinal cord are those nerves coming from? C3 to C5. Where do you only find the phrenic nucleus in that central nuclear group? At C3 to C5. Accessory spinal nerve. The accessory spinal component, right, that is going to be coming from C1 to about C5. And that is going to be supplying the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. So what does this one supply? Sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscles. Whereas the phrenic nerve will supply the diaphragm. Beautiful. Onus nucleus. This is only present from S2 to S4 in that central nuclear group. And this is going to be going to your sphincters. The external sphincter, so the external anal sphincter and external urethral sphincter. And it also goes to the muscles involved in the erection and ejaculation process. Okay? So that is another thing I want you guys to remember. So again, central nucleus. Within that central nuclear group, there's specific nuclei that are scattered in there that are only present at these segments of the spinal cord. Beautiful. Next one. We already talked about the medial nuclear group, right? No, actually we didn't. Let's talk about the medial nuclear group now. So now that we have our medial nuclear group, there's something that I need to kind of address here because this is kind of going to give you that somatotopic arrangement. So we have a line here, right? This line that's going this way. This is separating these nuclei into a posterior portion and an anterior portion, right? What I want you to remember first with this somatotopic arrangement here is that the nuclei that are going to be on this posterior portion are primarily supplying the flexors. So they're supplying your flexors. On this side of that line, so these kind of nuclei that will be situated here, on the anterior aspect of this imaginary line, this is going to be supplying our extensors. Okay, so when you look at these nuclei, the nuclei that are situated more posteriorly in this anterior gray horn supply the flexors. The nuclei that are more situated anteriorly in the anterior gray horn supply your extensors. Beautiful. Next thing, we have another imaginary line here. You see these purple lines here? They're separating, again, these nuclei, right? So the lateral nuclear group, guess what I want you to remember that they supply? They supply your distal limbs. So imagine that as kind of like your forearms, your hands, right? The muscles of that area. The central nuclear group, guess what they supply? The proximal aspects of your limbs. Maybe your shoulder joint, maybe your biceps. So that's going to be your proximal limbs. And then this medial nuclear group, guess what it supplies? Your axial musculature, so your trunk and your neck, right? So this is going to supply your axial musculature. All right, beautiful. That explains our somatotopic arrangement. That describes the nuclei. That describes their basic function. Now, one more thing here. These are cell bodies that are going to your somatic motor neurons, right? So these are cell bodies of the somatic neurons going to skeletal muscles of the distal, proximal, and axial limbs, or axial structures, both flexors, extensors. But guess what else? You guys remember that we have these things called upper motor neurons coming from our cortex, coming down here into the spinal cord, right? And then synapsing on the cell bodies here in that spinal cord going out. So this was our upper motor neuron, and this was our lower motor neuron, right? What were these structures called that are going from the cortex to your spinal cord? Your corticospinal tracts. The corticospinal tracts synapse on these neurons. So these are cell bodies, right, in this area of the anterior gray horn. They're a relay station for the upper motor neurons that'll synapse onto them, stimulate them, and then go to the skeletal muscles of flexors, extensors of distal limbs, proximal limbs, and the axial skeleton. Beautiful. That's all I want you to know for right now. Okay, we already talked briefly about lamina 10. Just to remind you, all it is imagine here we have a sensation coming in. Dorsal gray horn, right? So the dorsal root ganglia coming into the dorsal gray horn, synapsing here, and then it crosses over here and then goes up. You see how these axons are crossing over to the other side through that gray commissure? That's all it is. And since it's gray, what does that mean? That means the axons are not myelinated. Boom, let's move on. All right, so now what I want to do is we already talked about the kind of the function of laminas 9 and 10. Let's now talk about some functions of some of the other lamina or their associated nuclei. Like which ones? Remember in lamina 1, there was the posterior marginal nucleus, right? And this was situated within lamina 1. Now, basic thing that I want you guys to know about this one. Simple, straightforward, to the point. This is receiving these nuclei associated right here. I'm going to put one nuclei there. These are picking up pain and temperature sensations. Pain and temperature sensations. And if you really want to add on to that a little bit more, guess what kind of pain and temperature sensations from what types of pain fibers? This is primarily fast pain. So this is carried on your A delta fibers. Okay, your A delta fibers. That's all I want you to know. So if you guys kind of remember, here's going to be the receptor picking up the pain stimulus, carrying that on this sensory neuron through the peripheral branches of this pseudo-unipolar neuron. Then its central branch sends into that dorsal gray horn, synapse on the cell bodies of the posterior marginal nucleus, and then what will happen is it'll cross over and enter into your anterior or lateral spinothalamic tract. So this becomes a part of, it leads into your anterior lateral spinothalamic tract. That's all I want you to know about this one. Okay, next one we have is the S, substantia gelatinosa. So substantia gelatinosa of Rolando, right? This was occupying lamina 2. Now, a couple things that I want you guys to know about this one. This guy, he also picks up pain and temperature sensations. But the type of pain and temperature is slow pain. Do you guys remember what the fibers were that carried slow pain? That was your C fibers. Okay, that was your C fibers. The other thing I want you to know is that it actually becomes a part of that anterior lateral spinothalamic tract. The last thing I want you to know, just as a fun factoid here, is that the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando, as you ascend up the spinal cord, it becomes a specific nucleus in the medulla, and that is called the spinal trigeminal nucleus. This is for cranial nerve 5. And that is, again, present within the medulla. So it becomes the spinal trigeminal nucleus within the medulla. And again, I'll give you guys a basic concept. Here's that cell bodies there, picking up a pain stimulus, carrying it down this sensory neuron into the dorsal gray horn, synapsing, and then crossing over and then ascending upwards. One last thing I want you to remember here. Do you guys remember in that video when we talked about pain modulation? You had the gate control theory. Remember that we had in the central nervous system, like that locus coeruleus and the dorsal median raphe and all those periaqueductal, periventricular gray matter, all those structures. They were sending axons down to inhibit the pain pathway. Okay? It is also involved in pain modulation. So I also want you to remember another function of this substantia gelatinosa of Rolando is that it also is responsible for that descending pain pathway or pain modulation. Boom, let's move on. So next one, we have the nucleus proprius. The nucleus proprius. You guys remember this one? We already talked about that occupies laminas 3 and 4. Big thing I want you to know about this one. It takes pain and temperature sensations. Pain and temperature sensations. It takes touch. It takes vibration sense. It takes proprioception. This son of a gun takes a bunch of different information, right? So pain and temperature, it's going to be both C fibers and A delta fibers, right? Touch, vibration, proprioception. That's primarily carried by A beta fibers and 1A fibers. The big thing I want you to know about this one is the same concept. Here you have a stimulus, whether that be a touch, whether that be vibration, whether that be position sense with your proprioceptors, whether that be pain and temperature. These guys can send information onto the cell bodies in laminas 3-4 to the nucleus proprius. And what will he do? Cross this over and go up as a part of what? The spinothalamic tract, or he can give off cell bodies that move up via the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. We know these things, right? So we know that it can actually give way to the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway or the spinothalamic tract. Boom, roasted. Lamina 5 and 6. Again, we didn't have any specific nuclei, so we're just going to talk about the function of lamina 5 and the function of lamina 6. All right. Just for the simplicity's sake, lamina 5. Okay, let's talk about that one first, right? So what I want you to remember, we're going to talk about lamina 5 primarily over here on this part of the diagram. So lamina 5. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one because it's not a super important one. What I want you to know, really all I want you to know for lamina 5 is that this is carrying pain and temperature sensations from the viscera. That's all I want you to know. So if you have visceral sensations coming from different areas, right? Here's your stimulus carried on this sensory neuron. It's going to come in to the cell bodies in lamina 5, and then it's going to cross and go up, right? As a part of your anterior lateral system, right? And again, synapse here, and cross over and then ascend upwards. But it's primarily going to be kind of that pain and temperature sensations from your visceral organs. Okay? That's all I want you to know for lamina 5. Lamina 6, on the other hand, this one's actually really cool. All right, lamina 6, I want you to remember two functions for lamina 6. One is it is involved with what's called your ventral spinocerebellar tract, which is from L2 to about coccygeal 1. So it's picking up sensations primarily from the lower extremities. And so if you guys remember, that's picking up proprioceptive sensations. So it's picking up proprioception. Okay? And that proprioception that's stimulating these sensory neurons will come into your dorsal gray horn synapse on the cell bodies here, cross over, and then ascend upwards as your ventral spinocerebellar tract. And then eventually that ventral spinocerebellar tract will then move into your cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncles and then cross behind and come to the other cerebellum on the same side of the stimulus. So that's one thing I want you to remember. The second thing I want you to remember is that lamina 6 is also involved in limb reflexes. So you know, like if you have some type of painful stimulus, let's say you poked your hand or you stepped on a nail. Whenever you do that, there's going to be a stimulus, right, to a particular receptor. that's going to come into your dorsal gray horn. It's going to synapse on cell bodies in lamina 6. And then the cell bodies in lamina 6 are going to send some specific pathways to stimulate the motor neurons, your anterior motor neurons that are going to your skeletal muscles, to come out and stimulate a skeletal muscle and cause that skeletal muscle to contract. So for example, if I stepped on a nail, what's my response going to be? Pick up my foot. So the stimulus to the pain receptors in the foot sends it to my spinal cord, activates the motor neurons that are going to go to my flexors and pull my foot off. Okay? So it's involved in limb reflexes. Boom, roasted. Let's move on to the next part. Next part is lamina 7. Now we said that there was 3 structures in lamina 7. We're going to blast through this part because it's pretty straightforward. Okay. First one we said was that intermediolateral nuclear group. And we said that that was only present at T1 to L2. The intermediolateral nuclear group are present right here in that lateral gray horn at T1 to L2. And what do these do? I only want you to know one thing. These are the cell bodies of the sympathetic nervous system, but primarily the preganglionic. In other words, this is the first motor neuron. It has to go to your second motor neuron, which is your postganglionic. So these are your preganglionic motor neurons. So cell bodies of the sympathetic nervous system. We're just going to add on here preganglionic. That's all I want you to know. Okay? And again, these are the motor neurons that will go to glands, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. That's what I was talking about with that visceral motor neurons. Beautiful. Boom, roasted. Move on. We have the interomedial medial nucleus. Interomedial medial nucleus. We said that that is only present at S2 to S4. There's no lateral gray horn at S2, S4. That's why we call it that intermediate zone. But there's nuclei here. And these nuclei are going to go to, again, cell bodies of the postganglionic motor neurons that will go to smooth muscle. That will go to glands. What are these structures? These are the cell bodies of the parasympathetic nervous system. Which type? Your preganglionic. So what are these again? These are your preganglionic. Boom, roasted. Move on. All right, the next one is called Clark's column or Clark's nucleus. And we said that Clark's nucleus is actually only found at level C8 to about L2, L3 of the spinal cord. Now, the only thing I really want you to know for Clark's nucleus is that this is where the cell bodies that'll act as a relay for making the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. And again, what kind of sensations does that carry? Proprioception. And it's only carrying proprioceptive sensations from what levels? Again, C8 to L2, L3. So that is important. Whereas ventral spinocerebellar was carrying it from L2, L3 to the coccygeal 1 area. Boom, let's move on. Here we have proprioceptors. They're getting stimulated from different positions of our muscle tendons, our muscle spindles, our joints, our ligaments, things of that nature. Coming in, dorsal gray horn. Comes into the dorsal gray horn of the spinal cord, synapses on the cell bodies of Clark's column. From here, it moves into our ipsilateral white column here, lateral white column, and then ascends upwards. And then we'll go through the inferior cerebellopeduncle and synapse in the cerebellum. That is the purpose of that structure. Move on to the last one. Boom, roasted. All right, lamina 8. Lamina 8 is really cool. I want you to know one thing and one thing only about this. This is going to be a relay station. So this contains cell bodies. Again, we had them right here, just to put that there, right? There was our lamina, because we had 9 all situated right here. I want you to know that this is going to be the cell bodies that are going to be picking up information. So they're cell bodies that are relay stations for the subcortical tracts. I know you guys know what the heck those are. We already talked about a video on them. What were they? Hit me. That was our rubrospinal pathway. That was our vestibulospinal pathway. That was our reticulospinal, both pontine and medullospinal pathways. And the last one is our tectospinal pathway. All of those guys were coming from different areas, right? Red nucleus, vestibular nucleus, pontine and medullary reticular nuclei, and the superior colliculus. All of these sons of guns were coming down here and synapsing on these structures here, on the cell bodies in lamina 8. Guess what the cell bodies in lamina 8 are for? They're going to go to the skeletal muscles, responsible for what? What does the rubrospinal play a role in? Distal flexion. What does the vestibulospinal play a role in? Extension, primarily of the trunk and limbs. Reticulospinal, depending upon which one. If it was the medullo, it was going to be for flexion. If it was the pontoreticulospinal, that was for extension. And tectospinal is for head and neck. That's it. Boom, roasted. All right, engineers, so in this video, we talked about the gray matter of the spinal cord. I hope it made sense. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you guys did, smash that like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. Also, if you guys get a chance, down in the description box, we'll have links to all of the things like Facebook, Instagram, Patreon, all that stuff. If you guys want to go check that out, we truly appreciate it. All right, engineers, as always, until next time.